You know, when we think of the partition of India in 1947, a pretty brutal story usually comes to mind, just this massive explosion of violence. But what if that story, the one we all think we know, is missing the most important piece of the puzzle? Let's take a look at the one piece that might just change the entire picture.
First, let's just try to wrap our heads around the sheer scale of this: 14 million. That's the number of people torn from their homes in what our source material calls the largest and the most terrible exchange of population known to history. It was a human catastrophe on a scale that's, frankly, almost impossible to imagine.
And the story we're usually told to explain this horror? It's one of spontaneous combustion. That these deep-seated ancient religious hatreds just finally boiled over and ripped a society apart. But a really powerful academic analysis of the partition suggests this populist story isn't just too simple, it might be dangerously wrong.
To get to a deeper truth, the analysis we're exploring today turns to a pretty unexpected place: a novel. Yeah, the academic paper we're drawing from uses Bapsi Sidhwa's famous book, Ice-Candy Man, to figure out the real root causes of the violence. The whole idea is that sometimes fiction can show us historical truths that the official records just miss.
And there it is. That's the core argument of the entire paper. It concludes that religion wasn't the driver, it was the vehicle. The real fuel for the fire, it argues, was the fight over land and the absolute political disaster of how the country was divided. So the key takeaway here is that something other than faith lit the match.
To really get this, we first have to see what was lost. The novel paints a picture of life before the partition that completely flips the script on that whole ancient hatreds idea. Let's look at the evidence.
In the book, we see a Lahore where communities weren't just putting up with each other, they were deeply woven together. The central character, a Hindu woman, is called an epicenter of communal harmony. Her whole world is filled with Muslim, Sikh, and Christian friends. This wasn't just tolerance, it was a shared life, and it was built on real trust.
And this detail just brilliantly illustrates the depth of that trust. This wasn't some fancy city thing. The paper points to these incredible scenes where villagers, hearing rumors of violence elsewhere, didn't turn on each other. No, instead Muslims swore on the Quran and Sikhs on their holy books to protect their neighbors, literally saying, "We are brothers. How can we fight each other?"
Which brings us to the central question of this whole explainer. I mean, if this was the reality on the ground, a reality of brotherhood and mutual trust, what on earth happened? What went so horribly wrong?
Well, the paper argues the answer isn't in prayer halls, but in political halls. It points to a series of very specific political decisions and failures that systematically took that trust apart, piece by piece, and created the perfect storm for chaos.
The analysis traces this clear, tragic path. It really starts back in 1905 with the partition of Bengal, which created these political divides. Then, in 1928, the Narrow Report makes the Muslim League feel totally ignored. Each step just widens the gap until 1946, when the failure of one last plan for united India leads directly to a massacre. The political foundation for peace had just crumbled.
So the paper really boils it down to 4 key triggers. First, you have the political deadlock. The major parties just couldn't agree. Second, the role of the British, who are accused of divide-and-rule policies and then just failing to keep order. Third, a rushed and totally unfair drawing of the new borders. But it's that final trigger that's identified as the most explosive, the fight for land.
Right. This is the linchpin of the whole argument. When the province of Punjab was split, millions of Sikhs were suddenly about to lose their rich ancestral farmlands. All of a sudden, the conflict wasn't abstract anymore. It was about your home, your livelihood, your entire future. This economic and territorial panic, the analysis says, is what turned lifelong neighbors into mortal enemies.
So, given all of this, the paper suggests that calling the violence purely religious isn't just inaccurate, it completely misses the point. It actually proposes a whole new way to frame what happened.
So let's look at this side by side. On one side, you have the myth, a spontaneous, frenzied outburst of ancient hatred. On the other, the reality argued in this analysis, a conflict that was actually triggered by political failure, fueled by economic anxiety over land, where religion became a tragic tool for identification and mobilization.
And this brings us to a much more accurate term for what happened: religio-political violence. It's a conflict that wears the mask of religion, but its heart is actually political and economic. The slogans might have been religious, but the goals were all about power, territory, and resources.
Okay, so why does getting this right matter, almost 80 years later? Because how we label the past has a huge impact on how we understand the present. And this is really the bottom line. If we just blame ancient hatreds, we let the decision makers completely off the hook. We ignore the bad policies, the failed negotiations, and the political arrogance that created the catastrophe in the first place. It's an easy answer that stops us from learning the really hard lessons.
This analysis of the partition forces us to ask a much bigger question. What happens anytime we reduce a complex historical tragedy to a simple story? We don't just risk misremembering what happened. We risk repeating the exact same mistakes. By failing to see the real political and economic triggers of conflict, hiding right behind the mask of identity,